If Earth had rings like Saturn, things would be very different and very beautiful. Imagine stepping outside at dawn and looking up, only to see an enormous shimmering arc of rock and ice stretching from horizon to horizon like a divine crown hovering in the sky. You wouldn't need a telescope to see it. It would be right there, painted across the heavens, dazzling even the sleepiest commuter. But while it sounds like something from a fantasy painting, it turns out the rings would change far more than just our Instagram backgrounds. Let's assume the rings are similar to Saturn's, mostly ice, some rock, and ranging from a few meters to kilometers thick. Unlike Saturn's vertical orientation, Earth's rings would likely orbit around the equator due to our planet's gravity and rotational axis. That means only people living near the equator would see the rings as complete, massive circles arching high above. The farther north or south you go, the more the rings would tilt and flatten until they disappeared below the horizon, just a shimmering glow at the edge of the sky. Cities like Quito or Singapore would have front row seats to the universe's best light show. At night, the rings would catch sunlight long after the sun had set, creating brilliant glowing bands overhead, brighter than the full moon. Lovers would take ring light strolls, poets would write about the celestial path, and conspiracy theorists would definitely claim their ancient alien roads. But the rings wouldn't just be pretty, they'd have a powerful effect on our lives. For one, they would completely change how we think about time. The moon currently dominates our night sky, guiding tides and calendars, but rings would outshine it in both brightness and consistency. In fact, lunar phases would be less important. People might track the seasons by how the sunlight glints off the rings at different times of year, like a natural heavenly calendar. That, or we develop entire myths and traditions around the first full shimmer or winter ring eclipse. Speaking of eclipses, those would be spectacular. The rings would cast shadows on the Earth's surface in sweeping circular patterns, moving gently across entire countries during certain times of year. Imagine a shadow in the shape of a curve slowly gliding over your city, like a silent cosmic sundial. Festivals would pop up to celebrate these events, perhaps even as grand as our New Year's Eve, if not more. After all, it's not every day your entire town is cloaked in the shadow of frozen stardust. Of course, not everything would be so romantic. The rings would reflect a lot of sunlight, especially during the day. This means some parts of the world would be slightly cooler, especially near the equator where the rings are most prominent. Agricultural zones might shift. Crops that once thrived might wither under dimmer skies. On the other hand, regions too hot to grow food might suddenly become fertile, ushering in entirely new civilizations, economies, and maybe even empires. But perhaps that's just a poetic thought, or perhaps not. Night navigation would also be turned on its head. For millennia, sailors have used stars to guide their journeys. Now, depending on your latitude, the rings might block or distort certain constellations. Imagine teaching a child about Orion's belt, only to have to say, well, you can only see it clearly if you go south of the ring's glare. Meanwhile, military strategists and pilots would need entirely new charts just to get a clear line of sight through the refracted sky. But here's where it gets a little more dangerous: space junk. The real Saturn's rings are relatively stable, but Earth is a planet filled with, well, us. If we had rings, anything we launched into space would have to be calculated with insane precision, or else it might slam into a field of icy debris. Rockets would need to go up through specific gaps in the rings, or risk exploding in a burst of glittering failure. Some scientists believe that even a single collision could trigger a domino effect, creating more debris that crashes into more debris, an orbital traffic jam of apocalyptic proportions, and yet we might learn to adapt. Perhaps we'd construct launch elevators that go up through the safest ring gaps, monumental towers stretching miles into the sky. Maybe in a rare stroke of global unity, nations would collaborate on a planetary orbital code, rules for how to ascend without getting shredded. Or maybe one nation would claim exclusive access to the most stable orbital corridor. Maybe they'd even build a city around the base of it, a capital of science, trade, and sky power. Just maybe. But the cultural effects, that's where things get really wild. Human art, religion, music, all would be shaped by the rings. Every mythology on Earth would have stories about the great sky bands. Maybe they'd be seen as the tears of a forgotten god, or the frozen breath of Earth itself. National flags might depict them. Children might be named Ring or Halo in honor of their beauty. Every language would have a word for that peculiar, indescribable light they cast at sunset. A light not quite gold, not quite blue, not quite real. You can imagine how many painters would try and fail to capture it. And of course, there's always the fear that one day the rings might fall. Saturn's own rings are slowly fading inch by inch. If Earth's rings did the same, what would we do? Would we try to rebuild them with artificial satellites? Would we mourn their passing like we mourn extinct animals? Or would we finally look up at a blank sky and remember what it was like to live beneath the crown of the world? Because that's what it would be, really, a crown. Not just of beauty, but of mystery, danger, science, and story. A glittering crown wrapped around the planet, not placed by kings or emperors, but forged by nature, yet revered by every civilization that ever dared to look up.